Okay, right. So welcome to the next session. And before we kick off, I'd just like to remind you that you can, of course, tweet during this session using the handle #PLSA Annual. And do remember to use the conference app for questions. So I'm very pleased to welcome Lord David Willetts here to talk about the work of the Intergenerational Commission. Lord Willetts has many titles, and I hope I won't embarrass him if I just cover a few of them. Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society, Honorary Fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, Visiting Professor at the King's College London, Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation, which, as you know, aims to examine and improve the situation of people on low to middle earnings. But most important of all, of course, is his title, Two Brains. And I'm very pleased that those two brains are available for us today. Now, 10 years ago, David came to talk to us at our conference about his new book at the time, The Pinch, How the Baby Boomers took their children's future and why they should give it back again. And I think it's the success of that book, and indeed the importance of the issues that it raised, is why most people now are familiar with the idea that the generations have got quite different economic challenges, particularly on issues such as jobs, housing, and pensions. And PLSA came up against the same challenges as problems when we've been doing our thinking about the future of retirement income and in our Hitting the Target report. And there we were particularly struck by the challenges of housing, that people couldn't get housing and therefore use it as an asset for retirement, and indeed the challenges of the costs of ageing, in particular problems around the lack of funding for social care. Now, fortunately, Lord Willetts has done a great deal of work on all of this. And so I'm hoping that, and I've asked him, that during his session, he'll try and shed further light on the challenges facing the young and other generations, and actually also to give them a platform for some of the interesting policy suggestions that they've come up with. And as a public policy warning here, in the words of Sir Humphrey, some of these are indeed rather bold, if not radical. David Willetts.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about some of the themes both in my book that came out in 2010, The Pinch. I'm now writing a second edition with, I have to say, more evidence, and drawing also on a report we've just produced from the Intergenerational Commission at Resolution Foundation on intergenerational fairness. And I have to say the work you do, PLSA does, is so useful. I think your idea of what we need to save in order to reach a target retirement income is a very good framework for thinking about some of these issues. Anyway, here are the basics, and you will, I'm sure, be familiar with this already. Let me check I'm using this properly. Maybe I'm not. But I think I'm using the right way around. Ah, yes, we are. Good. There we are. So, this is just a brief summary of the background to what I'm going to talk about, which is the different generations, and particularly the prospects for the big generation, the baby boomers, that just perhaps one or two people in this hall belong to, the generation born immediately after the war, defined by those two peaks in 1947 and 1964, when we had more than 1 million babies born. There's elaborate economic explanations for this, but I would observe it was also after 2 very cold winters. And that throughout that period, we never had fewer than 800,000 babies born, and we averaged about 900. Then this big fall, much smaller generation coming along behind us. Notice the low point immediately after the long, hot summer of 1976. And we've never really had more than 800,000 babies born since. And the core argument, the question really, is if you had a choice between being born in a big generation or a small generation, which would you choose? And the common sense answer is small generation. You know, go through life, business class, traveling business class, not economy class. Fewer sharp-elbowed competitors in the jobs market or the housing market. And what's interesting is in modern Britain, it looks to be working out the other way. It looks as if being a big generation has worked for our advantage. And my argument is that in a modern society, we can understand why. In a modern consumer economy, if you're a big generation, you've got enormous spending power in the marketplace. It is why the Rolling Stones are still on tour. We are the people who are buying the tickets. And as well as that, in a democracy, we have political power, we have voting power, so we can vote for programs that work to our advantage. So it's playing out at the moment that being a big generation is advantageous. I'm sometimes accused of kind of promoting generational warfare, but actually the belief that we all have an obligation to the old is widespread, as you can see here. People want to help, and young people don't want their granny and granddad to be managing on a terribly low income when they're pensioners. And equally, we all think that part of the deal of being in a modern capitalist society is that successive generations are better off. And those are two propositions which are part of the modern social contract, but there's widespread anxiety that we are failing to deliver them. People worry about the prospects for young people, and their top three concerns, which I'm going to focus on, are, as you can see, home ownership, pay, and pensions. So let me begin with the pay jobs story. And it is this is a kind of chart, incidentally, and I've got several for you like this, where we take 5-year age groups, people born in these 5 years, and we track here we're measuring their real pay as they go through the life cycle. And kind of, if you follow it through, you see the normal pattern. Every generation, every cohort, 5 years, successive 5-year cohorts, they're doing a bit better in the jobs market, earning a bit more than people 5 years before them at the same age. But if you look, you see that purple line of the people born in the early 80s, no better off, and the latest group actually behind. So we are now at the stage where, as you track through into their 30s, people in their 20s or 30s, early 30s now, could be earning less than someone the same age 10 or 15 years earlier. So the jobs market is not delivering for them. There are various explanations. One argument actually has been that our rate of improvement of investment in human capital has slowed down, and I think that is one of the challenges. So there's a human capital problem. Also, actually, contrary to some of the caricatures of young people, they're not uncommitted, disloyal, lacking in engagement. Compared with previous generations, if anything, they are moving jobs less frequently. And by virtue of moving jobs is one of the best way of boosting your pay and living standards. And they're surprisingly tied to their existing employer. They're quite risk averse. And there's a theme here, which interestingly Andy Haldane was touching on in a speech the other day. Have we imposed so many risks on them that because they're bearing a lot of risk already, they're actually living quite cautious lives? So that's the story on jobs. Then there is the story on housing, and I have to say it is very similar. Again, look at the lines and you see the classic picture, successive generations at any given age being more likely to own their homes, reaching a peak with the baby boomers, and then for Generation X doing less well and the millennials doing even worse than that. So your chances of being a homeowner by the age of 30 are now significantly lower than for previous generations when they were at the same age. So home ownership, as everyone knows, is going backwards. And alongside that, in some ways, given that resolution, as Nigel said, we particularly focus on living standards, this is not just home ownership. This is a wider problem of the way in which people live their lives, a massive increase and shift into private renting. And of course, private renting can be a stage of people's lives in their early 20s, but you have very little security in a private rented accommodation at the moment. By the time you're sending your kids to the local primary school and you're in private rented accommodation, or you're talking about whether as a pensioner you're going to be needing housing benefit to help with your rents, one of the biggest long-term fiscal costs that we face, then this really significant social change is a big deal. And those younger people are paying a lot more. The proportion of their incomes going in meeting housing costs, notably but not solely, rent, is higher than for any previous generation. So sometimes the boomers say to me, Well, look, we had a time, which is true, in our 30s when interest rates were very high. So this is capturing that effect. But look, gradual decline and at a lower level than what the younger generation are paying. So when you move from pay to living standards after housing costs, an even more acute problem for the younger generation, a lot of their money is going in paying rent. So I'm afraid it's a tough picture on pay, it's a tough picture on housing. Let's now turn to what you guys are all the experts on pensions. And this is a really significant change in modern Britain. This is, and I would not have expected, when I first started working on social policy way back in the 1980s, I did not believe that we would reach a position where the middle income pensioner, after housing costs and adjusting for household size, is, if anything now, likely to be more affluent than the average working age household. And whenever I say that, I get afterwards some letters on Basildon bond notepaper, in neat handwriting, biro, saying that I don't understand how tough it is for some old people. So I'm talking averages. But that's why I've added this slide here. It shows that the person who is at the 20th, whose income is at the 20th percentile, so if you're poor, the 20th percentile family of working age is managing on a significantly lower income than 20th percentile of pensioner. And this matters because an awful lot of social policy, public policy, provision, what do you pay for, what don't you pay for, just works on the basis that age is a good proxy for poverty. That if you help pensioners and older people, you are doing something that is well targeted on poverty. Look at the debate in the papers this week on the BBC and the free TV license. You can see actually it is no longer correct to assume if you're old, you're poor. It is no longer a good guide to social policy, though it was. Now, it's not all bad news, and actually there's some good news. These are the dotted lines are defined benefit pension participation, which we know is declining, but on a cross-party basis, auto-enrollment is a success. And when we are beating up on ourselves on things we can't do as a country, I think auto-enrollment is a good story, and it does mean that there is some saving. Now, pension saving is surprisingly widespread amongst the younger generation, and if anything, more widespread than it has been in the past. Now, as you all know, it's modest sums that we're talking about. It's nothing like enough for a affluent retirement, but it's progress, and it means there's something there as a vehicle, widely used, widely accessible, that if you're trying to do more in the future to help younger generation build up a decent pension, you've got a core, you've got a framework that you can use. But it is pure DC. And I sometimes say to my friend Adair Turner, his report was an excellent report, but he kind of gave up altogether on DB and went to pure DC. I still have an interest in, I think we have ended up with an awful lot of risk being borne by the individual. The younger generation are bearing far more risk in their pension provision in pure DC than many of the older generation who had, by contrast, the extraordinarily supportive and risk-bearing framework of the company DB. And we legislated over time to make that company DB promise so gold-plated and so secure, of course, that companies won't make any such promise like that in the future. But I still dream of some ways in which we could look at reducing the amount of risk that younger savers are bearing. Now, I'm supposed to check for time. Good, because I want to focus now on, if you think that was a tough picture of where we are, let me add one other angle, which is relevant for public policy, and then take you through some of the ideas from our report. So that first slide I showed you of the different size of different cohorts is the classic story of the python swallowing the pig, the big generation working their way through the system. We've just had 30 years when the boomers, the big generation, were by and large of working age. So we've had a period when these are not sort of dependency ratios calculated just on chronological age. This is actual actual non-workers relative to actual workers. It's why it bounces around a bit. So during a recession, actual workers falls. And so this is, you can see the underlying trend while the baby boomers are of working age. And this, and from now on, obviously we're forecasting, but on most scenarios, we're now in an environment where the number of non-workers relative to workers starts rising. That is a tough fiscal environment. It means you've shifted from a fiscal tailwind to a fiscal headwind, which means that we're now going to face much heavier problems in terms of tax and public spending than we have before. Now, as we try to work out what this means, let's forecast the future welfare state. And we're assuming here there are no sort of imaginative flash new initiatives here. This is just the kind of promises we are familiar with on the promises that have already been made on publicly funded pensions, on publicly funded healthcare. And what you'll find is interesting. Many other advanced Western countries face something similar, but each country has it in a distinctive form. Because in the UK we've got a reasonable mix of private and public saving in pensions, there is not a massive surge in social security costs. And indeed the increases in the female pension age, about to be general increases in the pension age, mean that our problem is, to be honest, not acute pressures on pensions, state pension spend. It is much more because unusually for an advanced Western country, we have such a high proportion of our healthcare costs socialised and met through public spending. So it's really what happens as the boomers, big generation, grow old and grow frail, and the amount that has to be spent on their healthcare. And it's the backdrop to the coming budget. This debate has started. The extra 20 billion a year that eventually will get into the NHS after the announcements last July, how are they going to be paid for? Who pays? If we follow the current structure of the tax system, where basically taxes are paid by workers, our baby boomer healthcare costs are going to be paid for by our kids in higher taxes. That's what this slide tells you. Given what we know, given the picture I've painted of the disadvantages they currently face in pay, in housing, and in pensions, are we comfortable with that being the way in which our healthcare costs are funded, and do we think that is politically and socially acceptable? So now this is where it really gets uncomfortable. I apologise. Here is the kind of another bit of analysis we've done. So one thing that has happened to Britain in the last 30 years is assets have risen relative to GDP. Wealth has risen relative. So this line is telling you that, against that axis, that wealth was about 300%, 3 times income. And in an extraordinary change over the last 20 or so years, it's now risen to 7 times national income. Obviously, QE has given that a boost, but the process began long before QE. So we're a country where assets are higher relative to GDP. And in a way, that's just the macro story behind the phenomenon of young workers who see a house multiply higher to their pay than a house was when the baby boomers started trying to get onto the housing ladder. But meanwhile, the proportion of GDP that is paid in taxes on property and wealth has remained low at about 2.5% of GDP. And within that, by far the biggest element is council tax. And council tax, it's extraordinary. It's officially counted as a capital tax, but to be honest, it's become more and more like a poll tax than like the old rates. And it is an incredibly regressive tax where people in occupying a property worth £100,000 pay a much higher proportion of that every year in their council tax than someone in a property worth £1 million. So we've got this fiscal challenge looming. And if you are looking, and the question becomes, are we going to put extra taxes on the earnings of the younger workers? Or given what has happened to asset values, and given that the people who own the assets are by and large the boomers who are going to need the healthcare, shouldn't we be making some contribution where we can afford it out of our own property wealth? You can see why I had to stand down from democratic politics and become the chairman of a think tank. But anyway, so the commission that I chaired, which included representatives from, it had the Director General of the CBI, the TUC, we looked at all these and we had a range of proposals. We first of all thought that we should look at ways in which you could legitimately tax pensioners through NI in order to help meet the costs of the NHS, putting NI, any employee NI on the earnings of pensioners still in the jobs market, and more controversially, charging NI at some lower rate on occupational pension income above a high threshold. We also thought you should extend council tax, raise more from council tax to help ease the social care crisis. Again, something from which we benefit from, and we wrestled with a social care package. We didn't have some bold, completely new thought, but looking at my party's travails on social care, we basically said you need some floor of assets that are protected, say £150,000 worth, and you need some cap on the total care bill people pay, say 50,000. But within that, you should expect people above the cap, above the floor, to make a contribution up to the size of the cap. We think that there is a lot of risk being borne by the younger generation, and we're keen to look at ways in which you could lower that, both by changes, for example, better rights of tenants in the private rented sector. We also, when we observe the housing market, see that housing consumption is relatively undertaxed compared with other forms of consumption. So the second home is quite a tax-efficient asset. 10% of baby boomers have a second home. A lot of those rents that you saw the younger people paying, they're paying to the older generation who've got a buy-to-let property somewhere. And when you look at the way in which council tax works, CGT, we thought that there should be increased taxation on second homes. But property taxes aren't all perfect. We think stamp duty has got to too high a level and is impeding the free movement of the housing market. We wanted to see more houses built, getting more land on the market, including the prospect of public authorities buying land in an auction at below development value. So we have a range of proposals for tackling housing. We had a range of proposals here, you can see, on pensions as well. Some of them, and I've been influenced by my conversations with Nigel and others. CDC we're very interested in, but I know some people are quite sceptical of CDCs. There may be other things we can do to reform pensions. I'd be interested in your ideas. On pension tax relief, we argue you should spread out the tax relief, but we would not reduce the overall value of the tax relief. If you reduce the overall value of the tax relief, you're once again basically taxing workers to make a tax transfer to help the older generation meet the NHS costs. We are not against pensions tax relief. We just like to see it spread more widely with many more beneficiaries than losers. We think that's better than attacking it as a source. And we think we're pleased with the success of auto-enrollment, and think there are ways we could look at both increasing the amounts contributed and extending participation in it. Once we've through the hurdle of April 2019, which we hope we navigate successfully. And then there are other proposals for funding the welfare state. We think that working age benefits are now getting too low, haven't been frozen. And just think what would happen if there was a cash freeze in the value of the state pension. We thought absolutely outrageous. We've been having a cash freeze in the value of benefits for working age families. We're now into the third year. And because inflation is higher than forecast, it's a deeper real cut than was proposed at the time. And then finally, one of the more radical proposals is about a kind of citizen's inheritance. And because these are all funded proposals, the reason why I'm onto this rather uncomfortable agenda of tax increases is that I began my career as a Treasury official, and the director of the Resolution Foundation, my colleague Torsten Bell, began his career as a Treasury official. We both therefore set the framework for our commission report that we weren't going to spend money we didn't have. That's why we were driven into having to focus on how you would raise taxes, partly to meet the forecast costs, things like the NHS, but also if you want to do anything extra, you've got to fund it. And by the time you have reformed council tax, tax pensioners who are working, put some tax on occupational pension income, reformed inheritance tax, which is a classic bad tax, 40%, very high rate above a very high threshold, you start raising some revenues that you can use. And we proposed £10,000 as a kind of citizen's inheritance for people roughly when they got to the age of 30, which they could use either to pay for more education or to start a company or meet entrepreneurial costs, or for housing, deposit for buying a house, perhaps even just a deposit to help meet rents, rental commitments. Or, of course, we're very fortunate with auto-enrolment, or to put into a pensions vehicle such as Nest. Now, an awful lot of the media coverage focused on that, and the interviewers would say to me, £10,000, what's that worth? Why bother with that? £10,000 doubles or more the asset position of 2/3 of people aged 30. Or from the perspective of a young generation, that is enough really to change their prospects in many parts of the country of getting onto the housing ladder, and significantly changes the amount of money they have in their Nest auto-enroll pension. So our view was, and speaking, if I may, as a Conservative, and Resolution is a cross-party organisation, the Commission was a cross-party activity, but my party was a party of property-owning democracy. And what we're actually presiding over now is property ownership going into reverse. Less and less home ownership, less substantial pension saving. And I want to tackle that, and I want once more to see more people property owners. So those are the type of ideas we proposed. They're not easy, they're not politically possible, all of them today, in today's debate. But when you think back to those long-term fiscal trends, we are going to have to do something, and I believe these ideas should be on the agenda in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So I'd just like to abuse the chair's prerogative here and get in the first question. You talked about a number of quite radical proposals, and as you said, difficult even to argue from elective politics to be doing those things. I wondered, of the sort of 10 or so main ideas that the Intergenerational Commission came up with, which one or two, if you could only have one or two, might really make the most difference?
Council tax has become a very bad tax. In fact, one of the things I discovered working on it, to be honest, I'd been a junior minister in John Major's government, and I had vaguely thought council tax had sort of sorted out the local tax debate as a compromise between rates and poll tax, and hadn't really, in the course of my ministerial career subsequently, ever really had to think about it. I was shocked by how bad it's become and how low it is in practice on high-value properties in the southeast, but how high it is in low-value properties across the country. And interestingly, of course, as you'd expect, a generational shift. So low-value properties increasingly occupied by young people, high-value properties increasingly occupied by old people. So that would be number one. And then secondly, I have to say inheritance tax. People are scared about it because 40% is a horribly high figure. But the threshold is very high, and a lower rate, but with rather more people in it, and perhaps even the most radical reform, shifting it to a bequests tax. So the recipient pays it, and every individual has, say, $125,000 tax-free. I think those would be my top two.
I think they're probably my top two as well. When I read through the report, I was thinking, what would make a difference? Thank you very much for actually saying them honestly, rather than picking some of the easy ones. Because in line with a question that's come in on the app, perhaps the answer is obvious, but why is it, what barriers do you see to trying to actually achieve either of those two reforms, be it to property taxation and inheritance taxation? And how can they be overcome?
Yeah. Well, this was kind of my frustration. So when we brought out the report, and I did the Today programme that morning, the interview, after about 30 seconds on what we were actually proposing, turned immediately to what's politically possible. The government can't do it. To which I said, honestly, these big things, of course, and I do talk to my former colleagues, my friends who are in government today, I fully realise with the government and you've just had Andrew Marr on the political situation, they're not going to have the political capital to do this today. There are more modest things that are coming onto the agenda. But the aim is to win a wider public argument. So in future, this is doable. And the most optimistic trend, as an example of what can be achieved, back in 2010, when asked the crucial NIMBY question, do you agree more houses should be built in your area? Only 26% of people agreed. Now we are on 54% of people agreeing. My party has now just recently proposed liberalising the funding regime so that local authorities can once more build council housing, and the pressures to increase land available for house building is enormous. So I think but back when I brought out my book, people thought that it was impossible we were going to accept more houses built because it was so controversial and they only wanted to build on green fields. So the debate can shift.
So it's an argument for political leadership.
Exactly. This argument can shift over time.
Now, I've got various questions on the app, but I'd very much like to take some from within the room. We've only got 3 or 4 or 5 minutes left. And in fact, Lord Willetts' train probably means we really should keep it to absolutely no longer than that. So is there someone with a question? And there's a person over there on the left. I can see them near the front waving, and there's not a microphone there yet. And are there any others? Okay, so that's number 2.
Thank you very much. It's Alistair McQueen from Aviva. You followed a bleak presentation from Andrew Marr with another challenging presentation, so thanks for that on a Friday morning. You propose, and I agree, a fundamental change to social policy in the UK. I would argue the last time that the UK did that was the Beveridge report, arguably in the shadows of the Second World War. Love it or loathe it, is Brexit going to bring a trauma to the UK that could somehow politically bring onto the agenda another fundamental look at how we approach social policy in the UK?
I think Brexit does do that, and it's very tricky because there is an intergenerational angle to it, and it's very hard to put it in a way that people find acceptable. We're all familiar with the tilt age for Brexit being 45. Under 45s voted Remain, over 45s voted Brexit. But actually, for people in their 50s and 60s, the Brexit majority was quite small. If the voting population in the last referendum, if voting had simply been the under 75s, there was still a Remain majority. You only got to Brexit with the over 75s. Hence that brilliant description of Brexit as grandma's worst ever Christmas present. Because actually some of these old people thought they were doing it for their kids, though it's not going to have that effect. Yes, so I think it does open up a much more radical debate, especially what older people are going to contribute, because Brexit is their policy.
Okay, thank you. Then number 1 there. Sorry, we can't hear. Is the microphone on? And sorry if you could say who you are.
1, 2.
My name's John Payne. I don't have much problem with the analysis, but I think it hides quite a lot of pension inequality too, in the sense a lot of people still only have modest savings and modest house values, and the simple kind of populism of it does cause a tension for me in the sense that it raises real questions about the divide, which aren't being fully explored. And for me, one of the issues for me is a big issue is student debt and loans, which has caused considerable inequality, and that we need to address some of those issues rather than simply saying that the baby boomers are very wealthy.
Yeah, well, 2 quick comments on that. Within our report, we have very careful distribution analysis of the tax proposals here, and we show how a very high proportion of them involve most of the revenues coming from the more affluent 25% of pensioners. So most of these proposals are not targeted on those pensioners who are managing on low incomes. And on graduates, so the question is, what does the former universities minister, how does he answer the criticisms from the author of The Pinch, which is, you might almost say you need 2 different brains to wrestle with that question. Okay. And there, if you actually look at what the younger generation are having to do, it is 9% tax on earnings above £25,000. It is not a conventional debt like an overdraft or a mortgage or anything like that. It's basically, you only pay back if you are indeed a graduate in a well-paid job. If you're not in a well-paid job, you don't pay back.
Now, we're out of time, but I'll just take one more question. So I think is number 3 there a question? No, so number 1 on the right-hand side there. If you could say who you are, and then that'll be the last question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Skip McMullen. You say that the report was broad in the sense it was Labour and Tory input to the report. How was it shared with the Shadow Chancellor, Labour Shadow Chancellor?
Well, we have a kind of division of responsibilities. Though we are cross-party, Torsten, the director, who used to work for the Labour Party, for Labour Chancellor, Alistair Darling, tends to communicate more with Labour, and I tend to take more responsibility for communicating with Conservatives. He certainly has had conversations with Labour frontbench spokesmen on this, just as I've had conversations with Conservative ministers on it. I would say, actually, it's quite cross-party. People can see there's a problem, but the question is what is politically acceptable, and Labour themselves are very cautious. They've made some pretty expensive promises on maintaining the triple lock and things like that. So I think it really, they're comparing notes with Torsten. They're quite similar sort of conversations.
I must say, I did notice looking through all the proposals, it did look like the government has actually adopted 2 or 3 of them, as you were mentioning, which did make me wonder at the level of tea room conversation in Whitehall. Anyway, so we are out of time. If you could perhaps join with me in thanking Lord Willetts for his very interesting talk, which clearly could have merited another half hour of Q&A. But please join with me in thanking him.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.